Hello, saver. Whether you're saving for that trip to the tropics or saving for an emergency, now is the time to take advantage of Wells Fargo's savings options. Wells Fargo offers savings accounts that can help you save towards your goals. So, what are you saving for? Visit a Wells Fargo branch or wellsfargo.com/save to open a savings account today.
Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
So our podcast is called Right and Wrong.
Are these your notes?
These
These are your notes about what we're going to say?
Anything.
Nailed it.
Is the short answer.
So how many novels did you not finish?
Oh my God, so many.
It was perfect. What's she talking about? This is nonsense.
Ooh, a spicy question. I love it.
This is it, guys. The big secret to getting published is you have to write a good book. You heard it here first. Hello, and welcome back to the Right and Wrong podcast. On today's episode, I'm very excited to have best-selling superstar YA author Alexandra Bracken. Hi, Alex. Welcome to the show.
Wow, what a flattering intro. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
I mean, I was very excited to have you. You are, for someone so young, you are so accomplished in publishing. You have, when I looked up how many books you had out, I was honestly shocked. I was like, really?
Honestly, I have been telling people my new book, Silver in the Bone, is my 13th book for about 6 months. And then I actually counted and it's my 14th book. So yeah. I would like to apologize to my Star Wars book, my little retelling of A New Hope, because sometimes I just completely forget that book exists.
At least you know which one it was that you weren't counting.
Yeah. I was like, does someone count if it's not totally original fiction? I don't know. Yeah. It's been a wild ride. I've definitely been doing this a long time, and I'm starting to feel a little bit like an elder in the young adult community, which blows my mind.
Oh, okay. That's a daunting thought. But let's talk about your 14th book, brand new, which will be out by the time this airs, Silver in the Bone. Tell us a bit about it.
Yes. Okay. So this is one of those books where I have been struggling for months to figure out the right way to pitch it. And then one of my author friends very recently was like, oh, it's kind of like this meets this. And I was like, that is exactly this book. So it's kind of like a young female Indiana Jones crossed with Arthurian legend with a dash of, and this was the missing ingredient, The Last of Us. And it has like a rivals to lovers romance and a ton of twists. But to be completely honest with you, I have been very taken aback by the amount of professional reviews, like trade reviews rather, that I've gotten that have cited that this book is fantasy and horror. I was like, I didn't write a horror book. And until my friend was like, actually, there is like some light flavoring of The Last of Us, kind of a little bit of a zombie essence thrown in there. I was like, oh yeah, now I'm getting why all of the reviewers said this. But I can give you a nice detailed plot pitch if you would like that too.
Let's hear it.
Yeah, it's the story of 17-year-old Tamsin, who along with her brother has grown up in this hidden world of treasure hunters who seek out magical relics. But the one thing she really desperately wants is to find an object powerful enough to break a terrible curse that's slowly but surely consuming her brother. And when she finds out that their missing guardian may have vanished looking for an object like that, known as the Ring of Dispel from Arthurian legend, she sets out to follow her guardian's trail to the ring, and along the way, she ends up working with, of course, her infuriatingly handsome and charming rival, a young sorceress, and who want the ring for their own mysterious reasons. And the search ends up bringing them into the other land of Avalon, of Arthurian legend. Only Avalon itself is suffering from a terrible curse, and soon they won't just be looking for the ring; they'll be fighting to survive. So.
Amazing.
A little sprinkly. That's the zombie essence maybe coming out a little.
The zombie. Okay, so you accidentally wrote a horror, but you were aware it was Arthurian legend was the goal. You zeroed in on that.
Yeah, sometimes it just happens that way. It happened that way with my Darkest Mind series too, where I didn't really realize I was writing a dystopian book. I thought I was writing sort of a sci-fi superpowers book, and some of it too is just what's kind of out there in the world and pop culture too. It kind of determines how the book is seen a little bit. Because for marketing purposes, the publisher wants to be able to kind of fit it into a genre a little bit more neatly. So sometimes it gets like kind of shoved in there, even into like one in particular, even if it's, blends a couple different genres. But I've been reading, are you familiar with John Truby at all?
I'm not, no.
He's basically, I want to say he's like a screenwriting coach, especially. He kind of focuses, his specialty is like screenwriting, but he has a book called Anatomy of a Story that I love. It's a wonderful book for novelists, for screenwriters. It is definitely not necessarily for beginners. Like if you're just starting out on your writing journey, it may be a little bit overwhelming because he goes into such detail, but it's such an interesting way of thinking about constructing story. But that's a long tangent to get back to my point, which is he just recently released this absolute beast of a book about genre. And it's been so interesting to read through the horror section, the fantasy section, and the myth section, and to kind of like tick off in my head. And I think all authors do this, where they are kind of subconsciously tapping into these various genres and pulling in the different tropes.
Yes.
So it's a fabulous book. I think it's literally called Anatomy of Genres. It's right behind me. And it looks like it's 3,000 pages long, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I mean, you want a big reference book, right? Because you're not reading it cover to cover necessarily. Exactly.
You're kind of thumbing through it. Although I admire anyone who would be like, you know what, I'm just going to commit like 2 straight weeks of reading this book before and taking notes.
It's a gripping read.
Exactly.
But genre is so funny because it's interesting that you say when you're describing The Darkest Minds that you kind of pitch it as like a dystopian superhero thing, superpower thing. Whereas like there's sort of such a tight crossover between saying that and also saying like modern urban fantasy, because lots of your stuff's also set in real cities, right? Like New York, Boston.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the term that we're using now is contemporary fantasy. I was like, when did it change from urban fantasy to contemporary fantasy? But yeah, like I would probably consider The Darkest Minds at least a little bit of contemporary fantasy. It sort of comes down to how you how you would break down science fiction versus fantasy when it comes to superpowers or just the overall story world and all of that. But I kind of love that though about writing, where I'm sure you have experiences too, where you're writing something and your subconscious has been working so hard in the background on something, and you reread what you've written and you're like, oh, I thought the story was X, but it's actually Y. I know some authors are very, very like good about following an outline and they are in complete control of their story, but I am basically functioning on just like waves of chaos over here, and then it takes me eventually to where I'm going.
Oh, okay. So you're not a planner or plotter, you're much more a discovery writer?
Yeah, I think I kind of fall somewhere in between now. When I first started, I was purely a discovery writer, and then I kind of forced myself to go back and really learn craft, which is not something I'd had any sort of formal education on, either in university or really, I guess you wouldn't really have creative writing craft in high school, but I really went back and started. That's when I discovered John Truby. I like really went back because I wanted to be able to articulate my writing process better than just saying like, I don't know, I had this mental image in my head and the character just sort of started talking to me. And so for a while, for like a stretch of my career, I tried so hard to be an outliner. And now I have kind of like swung back into being a little bit more of a discovery writer. And I think that's where I have the most fun. But I do outline the like couple like I'll do the next 3 chapter batch rather, excuse me.
Okay.
So like, yeah, I guess it's like headlights plotting is I think the term that people use for it, where
I've not heard that before. That's great.
So you're kind of driving along and you can see immediately what's in front of you and you kind of know the major stops along the way. But this way it gives me this kind of this sense of fun that I think I sometimes lack when I am working just completely off of a very rigid outline. So it's, the character is getting from point A to point B, but you don't necessarily know how.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So it's a lot of fun for me, but I think it can be kind of intimidating to write that way where you just are like going into a scene and you're like, we'll see where this takes me today. And you don't have as much control over the story. But going back and like teaching myself more about craft and learning more about craft has kind of given me it's given me a firmer foundation to stand on. So my more intuitive writing process can kind of take over, and I can trust that I have not gone completely off the rails.
Yes. Okay. So you feel like since you've been writing for a while now, and you feel like your writing and your style has kind of really evolved since you first started.
Yeah, which surprised me because I think I don't know, my goal with each book is just to write a better book than the last book. And so I will sometimes take a big swing and sometimes it's a big miss, but I am like always trying to push my storytelling. Yeah, it's so funny because you never quite know what's going to land with readers. And I never want to deliver the same story to them twice. And so some readers love that and some readers are like, but I wanted more of this. So it's kind of a gamble, but it's always fun. So a lot of times nowadays I'm like, how can I have more fun with this story? And it ends up taking me to a really fun place. And I just have to hope that readers will kind of follow. But it did surprise me that, like, looking back, it does surprise me that my kind of writing process has changed as much as it has, but everybody's brain likes to work in such a different way. I think it is important to kind of experiment and see what works best for you and be like constantly trying to find a way to streamline this absolutely massive process of writing a book.
Well, it's natural just to grow as well. As you get older, you're going to grow and you're practicing more and more. Every book is, in theory, practice for the next one, right?
Absolutely.
Do you ever flick through your old stuff? And this is something I've heard is very common. I know Zadie Smith always talks about this. Do you ever flick through your old stuff and go, I would not have written it like that now?
This is really embarrassing to say. It's less that and more, I have no memory of having written this. I think the way my brain works is that like I will get the story out of me. I will like download it onto the page and then my brain like immediately dumps that information and it's like on to the next project and slowly gathering that information.
Wow.
So it is.
That's efficient.
Yeah. I mean, I think I very rarely will go back and actually reread something after it's published or even reread sections of it. The only time I've really done it is ahead of writing a sequel, just wanting to like revisit something.
Yeah.
But I think it's sort of like, and I also cannot listen to my books on audiobook either, even though I have such a respect for the readers. And I have had some really wonderful audiobook readers, and I feel very lucky over that. But I think it must be somewhat like how some actors can't watch themselves on screen. I feel like if I go back and reread something I've written or I listen to something I've written, I will just be like cringing and get really bad secondhand embarrassment and be like, oh, I could have written that much better. So I guess yes and no, I kind of agree. But I think I just am so avoidant when it comes to that I like don't put myself in that position of going back and rereading.
That's probably healthy. You're focused on the present and the future, and you're just going to keep writing and writing more and better stuff. That's great.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I kind of, the further I get into my career, the more I think that is actually the secret to having a long career in publishing, is just to be able to like move on to the next and kind of learn what you need to learn from having written the book before and, jump into the next story and just keep going. Even if you have like a stumble where readers don't particularly love a certain book that you've written, it's like the recovery from that and like pouring your love into a new story. That's like what continues to carry you forward and generates that forward momentum over the years. So That's why it's so shocking to me to look back and be like, oh my gosh, I've now published 14 books at this point. I've gone through this process 14 times and it's just been like pure inertia carrying me forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of looking back, let's dial this back a bit. So I know that you sold your first book when you were still in college. So yes. I'm guessing that was that the graphic novel? Brightly Woven?
That was that was the original book that the graphic novel was based on. And what ended up happening was that I sold that book, Brightly Woven, the novel version, my senior year, my second semester of senior year, and it went on to be published the next spring, so 2010. And then it was with a small publisher. It was Egmont's USA brand, Egmont USA. They started up, like, I guess, a smaller North American arm. Shouldn't even say North American. It was really the United States arm. There we go. It's like trying to like change the way I'm trying to like get rid of saying something is American when I really mean the United States, because obviously there are other countries in North America. So Egmont USA just like very sadly went out of business. They decided to fold that US arm, and then the rights reverted back to me, and I felt like it was such an odd publishing experience where I had an editor who, and I was, really young at the time, 21, 22, trying to get this book into shape and trying to like achieve this dream of being published and make a career out of it. So I really deferred to this editor a lot on like what to cut and the edits. And I sort of, looking back on it, was like, I don't even really recognize my writing as much in this book. So I sat on it for a really long time and then decided if we were going to republish it, or if we were going to sell the rights to it to a new publisher, I wanted to either really revise the book or I wanted it to come out in a different format. So at that point, it had been pirated so much as the novel that I was like, I feel like maybe what I actually really want to do is to kind of experiment with like bringing it into a graphic novel format, because it is a standalone. I think it can be, it now feels very middle grade rather than young adult because of how kind of dark and mature YA has skewed over the last 13 years. And I was like, well, I feel like we should kind of experiment with like aging some of the characters down and just bringing it out in a different format. And it was really fun to play around with the story that way and see that it could be retold in a completely different format. So we had someone come in and adapt it from the actual novel, because I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm going to learn from this process the best I possibly can. And it was such an interesting journey though for that little book with the little publisher. Yeah,
that's really like, that's so cool that you wanted to bring it back, but as in a different form, in a different iteration. I think that's also that feels very brave as like one of your first kind of like things to do. You know what? Actually, let's change it up.
Yeah, it's funny too, because it had at the time, Brightly Woven had its like little fan base, and it like still amazes me to this day. I think that was one of the reasons why when I swung just like a completely different direction with The Darkest Minds, like I went from Brightly Woven to The Darkest Minds. A lot of people think The Darkest Minds was my debut, and it wasn't. Those readers were very loyal and followed me from this like kind of sweet high fantasy book into this sort of futuristic sci-fi dystopian world of darkness. And that was one of the reasons why I think that book was able to get a little bit of word of mouth. So, just right off the bat. But yeah, it felt like a worthwhile experiment to me, because I also knew the readers who had loved Brightly Woven would feel like a little bit nostalgic about it and would maybe want to see it in a different format too, to kind of bring it, next to the original book on their shelves.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, you were very young when you signed that publishing deal. Have you, I'm going to guess off that you've been writing or wanting to be a writer from a very, very young age?
Yes. Did you have this experience where you knew from a very young age that you wanted to be an author or you wanted to write stories? Was that true for you?
I didn't actually. I knew throughout all of my teens that I was going to be a rock star. So it was a different experience. It hasn't panned out yet, but fingers crossed.
Never say never. I mean, I feel like anyone can become a rock star with TikTok in the picture. Like anything
can happen.
Have to go viral. Yeah.
But it wasn't an author. That came later.
Oh, see, I love that. I feel like that's true for a lot of my friends. It really is kind of a mixed bag when we talk about this, where some of us, including myself, knew from a really young age. Like, I remember being in second grade and thinking to myself, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to write books for kids. Like, it was that specific of like, and I think honestly, it was just the thought process there was I loved reading. And I was like, if it's this fun to read, it will be this fun to tell stories. And that was, I think, second grade or third grade maybe was when we started having these little creative writing units in school, and they would have us write these little short stories based on whatever like science unit or history unit we were learning about at that time. So I remember like one of my first books was a story about how the asteroid belt was formed, and it involved like jealous planets or something.
I love how you remember these books, but you don't remember the published books.
Exactly. I was like, before my memory was broken. Before I had to like, memorize so much stuff in school. But it's also like our memories are so strong when they're attached to a very strong emotion, right? So
yeah,
I think when I was young, reading and writing just filled me with so much joy that I really remember some of those like early days of writing fan fiction and like publishing it under a pen name on fanfiction.net and getting reviews and learning from the reviews. But honestly, writing fan fiction really got me in the habit of writing consistently and meeting deadlines, because I would promise like I'm going to upload the next chapter of this, by next Friday or whatever. And so I would try to meet that deadline up so I wouldn't disappoint readers. And that is honestly like once you kind of get in the habit of writing daily, it carries you through writing a whole novel eventually.
That's great.
But yeah, I was definitely one of those really annoying kids who had this like shining sense of purpose of what she was supposed to do with her life. And I feel so lucky that I have been able to make a life and career out of it.
Yes. Yeah. What was your fan fiction?
Oh my gosh. I almost don't want to say because I think it's still on fanfiction.net. I don't know if like there has been any sort of purging, but it was there was some Star Wars, there was a little bit of Harry Potter back in the day.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there was some Sailor Moon fanfiction.
Yeah, a real mixed
I was
bag.
like very
That's great.
Yeah, it was all over the place, really. That's
So from this, from all of your cutting your teeth in fan fiction as a teen, was Brightly Woven, was that the first novel the kind of full novel that you wrote and then submitted and sort of put out into the world?
It was actually the second novel that I wrote. The first one that I wrote was for National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo. It was my freshman year of college because it was not already hard enough to go to university across the country to like be trying to double major. I was like, I'm going to finally write my novel because I had just heard about this novel thing called NaNoWriMo. And so I wrote a book. I wrote a novel that shall never see the light of day. It is really, really bad, truly bad. And I, at the time, though, was convinced of my own genius, which is honestly like another really important trait to have when you're first starting out. You almost have to have this like slight delusional belief in yourself, because that is the thing that is going to carry you through, getting feedback, harsh and like, other gentle, like it just is the thing where you have to like believe in yourself and believe in your story first and foremost before anybody else will. And so I think I had that delusion more as like an 18-year-old than I do now at 36, literally half a lifetime ago. But yeah, I wrote it and I was like, maybe I will try to get it published, because at that point, this would have been like 2006, I think. There was a lot more information online about like how to find an agent and how to query and all of that. And so I was like trying to query as I was, going to school, and absolutely nobody wanted this book, unsurprisingly. And of course I was crushed. And thank God nobody wanted this book. And so to kind of like ease back into writing, my friend who had helped me really edit that book, I wrote a new book that was like for her birthday. And that was what eventually became Brightly Woven. So technically it was the second thing I tried to write. And yeah, it had like a very special feeling about it. I think some writers kind of downplay their intuition when it comes to storytelling, or they, I don't know, they're not quite as, I really think it always benefits writers to kind of like listen to what your intuition is trying to tell you. Like if your intuition is saying this is a special idea, you should run with it. Like you should continue to develop it, even if it feels hard. Like that's an important voice to listen to in yourself.
Yes.
Not to get too woo-woo with you. Yeah. But I think I think we do have this voice in us, as like all creative people do. All people really have that kind of intuition. And it's just a matter of like whether or not you're willing to listen.
Yes. Yeah, no, I understand that.
Fargo, the new virtual assistant from Wells Fargo, makes banking faster and easier. Like this.
Fargo, what's my checking account routing number?
And this.
Fargo, turn off my debit card.
And this.
Fargo, what did I spend on groceries last month?
And that's just the beginning. Do you, Fargo? You can. In the Wells Fargo mobile app. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getfargo.
Terms and conditions apply. Your mobile carrier's availability and message and data rates may apply. Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
So once you were feeling good about this book, was this was it straight to the small publisher, or did you submit to agents and then it was through your agent?
So this is like one of the memories that I have such a vivid memory of. I was like, I was in bed. One of the things that has not been deleted yet. I was an RA. I was like a resident advisor. And I got a room. I had a dorm room to myself my sophomore year, which was awesome.
Nice.
And so I remember I was in this little like slightly roach and cockroach infested room. And I was laying in bed and I was about to fall asleep, and I sat up and I just like immediately knew how to write the query letter, and I wrote it all in one go. And that was the query letter I sent out. And I started getting, I know. Yeah. I mean, I lightly edited it so I wouldn't embarrass myself being like half asleep having written it. But it was this really weird moment. And then, I sent it out, and maybe, within a week or two, I started getting requests, and I was like, wow, like this is amazing. I'm so excited. But I think at the time it was like midterm. So I was also very stressed. And I remember like I had been taking one of my midterms, and I had a missed call from a San Diego area code. And obviously a lot of publishing in the US is based out of New York, but I knew that I had submitted to an agent who had I had submitted to Writer's House here in the US, and they had an office in San Diego at the time. And I had submitted to one of the junior agents out of that office. And so it ended up being that agent calling me to offer representation and just to chat. And it happened, this is again, like one of those really obnoxious stories, but it was my 21st birthday. And so I talked to her at my birthday dinner that I went out to at this little Italian restaurant with my friends. It was a very magical moment. But yeah, so I did find an agent after being rejected by quite possibly every single agent in the young adult kidlit world with that first attempt at a book. And then I still got plenty of rejections for Brightly Woven. And she and I worked on this book. We edited it for months and months. I'm trying to remember how many months it ended up coming down to, but I would wake up really early in the morning before classes, and I would go to one of the nearby computer labs, and I would work there rather than on my laptop, because I could like go to the vending machines and buy a Coca-Cola and a package of Cheez-It crackers for breakfast, because it was before the cafeteria woke up.
Nice,
the poor custodial
breakfast.
staff is like, exactly. I mean, I basically, if I am not like, my default setting when it comes to food consumption is like raccoon. I will like eat anything. So my health habits in college were not great. And so I would just wake up really early every single morning. And there's an Arcade Fire song that was my phone alarm at the time, keep the car running. And so every single time I hear this song, I like get this little jolt of like almost panic because of like when you first wake up in the morning and you hear that first couple of notes, you're like, oh my gosh. So it takes me right back to my roach infested dorm room.
Nice.
Yeah. So, and then, by finally, second semester, senior year, the book went out on submission, got rejected by some publishers. And then we ended up accepting this nice offer from Egmont because, it was going to be one of their first lists. They were really excited about it. And so, yeah, I mean, from there, it really was a wild ride. And that little, I couldn't write full time straight out of college, having sold that first book. And obviously that is the reality for most writers. You cannot just like quit your day job or immediately go from school to writing full time. I was very grateful to have that, like my advance as a initial kind of nest egg of savings when I was living in New York and working as an assistant in publishing and making like no money in one of the most expensive cities in the world. What a time.
So you were working as an editorial assistant?
Yes. My very first job in publishing was as an editorial assistant. I had done a program called the Columbia Publishing Course, which is sort of like this intensive publishing boot camp that you kind of go through for 5, I think, I'm trying to remember how many weeks it was. It was a couple weeks, but they would have speakers come in. You kind of form your own little mini publisher and you learn about all the different aspects of like the many different jobs within publishing, like sales and managing ed and editorial and all of that. And really the reason why people did this course and why I did the course was because they have a big job fair after. And when you went through this course, your resume would be, worked on within the course with a coach, and you would, your resume would go out with everybody's to all of these various different HR departments at publishers. And which is sort of, looking back, I was like, wow, that's really unfair that you have to like pay for this not inexpensive course. And I just like very randomly in my school, I went to the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and just like so randomly, they had a scholarship to one of the publishing courses. And I was able to get, I think I split the scholarship with another student who went to the publishing course, I think in Denver, maybe NYU. But anyway, this is a very roundabout story. Sorry. But yes, I was like, I know I do not want to be the one job I do not want in this industry is as an editorial assistant, because I know I will not have time to write my own books, because so much of being an editorial assistant is taking your work home with you, taking your reading home with you for submissions, doing a lot of editing work. And also at the time I was like, my strength is in drafting. It is not in editing. Those are like two very different parts of your brain. But the kind of wonderful thing about coming into the publishing industry is that you really do start almost no matter what department you enter, you start in an administrative position, really. And it's an apprenticeship industry in theory, where you are like taught everything you need to know as you advance up through the ranks. So naturally, the first job that I was like called in to interview for was an editorial assistant. And I was like, I better take this job because we're several weeks in now to me not having a job and having to pay for this apartment out of my savings. So I took that job. I had a very old school boss too. And I was just like, I will stay here for a year. I will do this job for a year and learn as much as I possibly can. And then I will move into a different area of publishing. So that's what I did. Eventually, I moved into a branch of marketing at Random House Children's Books. That's what you would call like school and library marketing, where it's marketing geared towards, educators and librarians. And you do a lot of presentations and book talk, and you book talk, not book talk.
Book talk wasn't a thing then.
I was like, wait a second.
That's
book talk was just a twinkle in somebody's eye at the time. And yeah, it was such an interesting job. It's sort of like somewhere in between being like a marketing person and a publicity person, because you also did all of the library shows and educator shows, like the American Library Association show. You would have a booth and you would, do more book talking there and hand out ARCs, galleys, that sort of a thing. So it was great. And even though that job ended up having a lot of travel to it, I was still able to kind of reclaim most of my weekends. And I wrote pretty much the entire Darkest Mind series exclusively on the weekends. And I had an absolutely insane, truly insane drafting schedule for those books, where it's like amazing. I still have like functioning organs because I lived on Mountain Dew. That was like,
wow.
Every Friday night I would go home, buy like a Chipotle meal, go to the CVS, the pharmacy that was on the corner of my street, and I would buy like 3 bottles of Mountain Dew, and that would carry me through the whole weekend. And I would stay up until I would write from like 6 p.m. on a Friday until like 4 o'clock in the morning, go to sleep, wake up at 9 or 10, write all day Saturday until like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, go to sleep, write all day Sunday. And then I would be like back to day job Alex during the week. But that was
oh my God,
what I was willing to, I know it. Yeah.
Are you okay, Alex?
I know.
You're reliving the trauma now.
Oh my gosh. Just thinking about it kind of blows my mind too, because I'm like, nowadays, if I'm not in bed by 9 p.m., I'm like grumpy. I'm like, I want to go to bed at 9 p.m. But I had no creature to take care of. I had no children, no dog. My dog has like forced me to have normal human hours. So that's great. Now I work a typical 9 to 5. But it was worth it for me because that was really the series that ended up kind of changing my life and eventually enabled me to write full time. But I think, it was pretty much the entire Darkest Mind series I wrote with that schedule on the weekends. It was really bad. I don't recommend that schedule.
that wild life that you used to lead.
Yeah, my wonderful party days in New York City of like being home. My like roommate, my poor roommates were like so good to me. They would like come and check to make sure I basically was still alive, that I had not like consumed so much Mountain Dew my heart had given out. They would kind of check in and be like, "Are you sure you don't want to like come out with us?" And I'm like, "No, I'm writing my book."
That's funny. Well, as you said, Darkest Minds is something, really took off and exploded, and very excitingly was made into a movie.
Yes.
Was it sort of surreal and wild to see that kind of story and those characters realized in live action?
Yes, it was. Surreal is honestly the perfect word for it. The thing that I think really surprises people is that I had pretty much nothing to do with the movie. I don't know if they had been like, they'd had like a really bad interaction with an author in the past, but it was really interesting because if I had not befriended the screenwriter, and his name is Chad Hodge, he's a wonderful human, wonderful writer. He is someone who is like, writers have to stick together, whether you're like a screenwriter or a novelist, because Hollywood just like does not respect writers for the most part. They are not treated especially well. And he would like send me the script or like tell me what was going on. Like he was the one who was feeding me all the information because I was really out of the loop. And so even though it took years, and this was, back in the time where now it's a little bit more common, like when you option a project, like you can usually like finagle your way into like getting an executive producer credit, and like you can be a little bit more involved and negotiate those terms. But like this was back in 2011, and because it was really only this one production company that wanted to option it, there was like no real way to negotiate. So it was like, you either accept it or you don't. And for me at the time, the option was a ton of money. And I was like, everyone kept telling me like, this will never get made. So like, it is essentially free money. for the time being.
Yeah.
Like, as long as they keep renewing the option, it is sort of just like this additional income that you can use for your savings and whatnot. So I was like, great, sounds good. Except then years later, when
It's something like 1 in 10 book options actually get made into films or television.
I would be shocked if it's even like that percentage.
It's so unlikely, isn't it?
Especially back then, because it was kind of, you know, I don't know if you happen to know this off the top of your head. I was like, when did the last Twilight movie come out? Because there had been enough success with like, Twilight, The Hunger Games, that
Divergent.
Divergent. Hollywood was like really going through buying up and optioning a ton of YA stuff. So it seemed even less likely at the time that this would get made. And I was just like, again, free money, because that is the reality sometimes. A writer, where you're sort of like, well, if I do want to be able to write full time and make a career out of this, I have to like build savings in order to carry me through the years, and not, keep raccoon hours on the weekends. But like on the whole, like, so for example, I really did not know who was cast in the movie until, for some of the roles, I didn't know who was cast until they announced it. Chad, the screenwriter, told me at least who the main characters were, so I knew that before it was announced. But like I said, I don't know if they had a really bad experience with an author coming in and like causing a lot of problems about changes. I thought I was actually fairly relaxed about the whole thing, because I personally I'm not like so precious about my work that I think it is flawless and shouldn't change at all, because the reality of transforming a story from the page to the screen, like, you were going to have to make some changes. And so I was like, like, great, like, we can talk through different things. I can give you my opinion on what I know the fans love and what they'll be really unhappy if you change, and so on and so forth. But this was the other thing that like absolutely killed me, was they would not let me come visit the set. They would let my publisher come visit the set, but not me. So my editor and some of the people at my publisher got to visit the set. I want to say like a month before I did. They only let me come for like the last 2 days of filming. It was very strange. So, but I loved the actors who played the main characters. I think the movie is super fun. It has a very different vibe from the book itself, so it helps kind of separate the two in my mind. But sadly, the movie really did not perform well. And even though at the time I was like, free money, I was like, oh, now as someone who is not like 23, 24 years old, who is trying to build her career, now I'm a lot more protective about who gets involved, like,
well, you have a lot more weight sort of to carry now.
Right. Yeah. I think there was kind of this overall sense of powerlessness in terms of that first film option and then eventual movie. It still blows my mind that they actually made the movie. It just like kept going and going and going. And like every single time the option. Yeah.
Someone's going to be like, oh, just kidding. We were never making it.
Exactly. I know. And really, because it can fall apart pretty much until they start filming. And sometimes it can even fall apart as they're filming, I guess. So I was like, until it's like fully in the can, I'm not going to like assume that this is really happening. But on the whole, like, I really love the people involved. I love the director. I loved the actors. I loved the whole cast and crew, who just like, when I did get to visit the set, made me feel so welcome and were so wonderful. And so now when I think about the film, which again, sadly, completely bombed, I think it actually set a record in the United States for like the biggest second week theater drop. Like, that's the level of it bombing. Yeah. So sometimes it can be like, wow, that was like the worst, best thing to ever happen to me. But I do appreciate that experience, and it was really surreal to be able to go to like San Diego Comic-Con and promote it and just get a glimpse into the Hollywood side of things, which is definitely a lot more glamorous and so fascinating compared to publishing. Publishing feels so old school compared to Hollywood in some ways. But yeah, I like don't mean to sound ungrateful, because I am really grateful that film happened, and it's still to this day is bringing new readers to that series. They're finding it. I think it airs every once in a while on FX here in the United States. And so, but like the price of my like free money mentality now is I get asked every single day if there's going to be a second movie. I'm like, no, there's not. I'm so sorry. Yeah, that's that's the tax I pay on having this film made.
Yeah. Well, you've got other series and other books. Like, I mean, you have a brand new book coming out, so you never know.
Yes,
New
fingers
stuff.
crossed something goes
Fingers
there.
crossed.
Yeah.
So before we get to the final question, I do have a question from a friend of mine and a fellow YA author, Melissa Welliver, who would like to know, as someone who's written and published both sci-fi and fantasy, do you think it's right that those two genres are often lumped together?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, the interesting thing about YA is that I've always felt like, and maybe this is changing a little bit now too, because of how indie publishing has really expanded. And I think with like Book Talk, especially, it brings a lot of those indie books, which might not have, you know, been right for a traditional publisher looking to like put it into a specific genre because it blended so many genres. Like Book Talk now gives them an avenue to be brought into a physical store like Barnes & Noble or Waterstones. I think YA, though, in particular, has always been a little bit freer in terms of blending genres. And so it's never bothered me that sci-fi and fantasy get lumped together. But I think it kind of comes down to the heart of the story, because I think if you're thinking about like Star Wars sci-fi, which was really my main avenue to Star Wars, because so I had a very early introduction to Star Wars, and I always thought of it as like fantasy more than science fiction. And I think some people would agree with that.
It is fantasy.
It has like
I think it's fantasy more because there's no real science. For me, science fiction has to have a scientific explanation, and there isn't really one in Star Wars.
Exactly. So like something like The Martian to me is like hard sci-fi, but then Star Wars is sort of like sci-fi fantasy. So I think for certain projects, it is fair to say something is sci-fi fantasy, but I think it's really kind of the heart of the book, almost less so than like the window dressings. Like I think Star Wars has like sci-fi window dressings, but it really has this like core like hero's journey, myth, legend, kind of like fantasy heart to it, I guess is how I would describe that. That's a really fascinating question. I really want to think about that a little bit more too, just because maybe if I were like, I don't know. I really don't know. But like I said, the one thing I've always really loved about YA and why it's never really bothered me to have some people say a book is fantasy and others say it's sci-fi, like The Darkest Minds, is just because I was like, well, yeah, there are elements and tropes that kind of pull from both genres. So sometimes I think it's fair to have them blended. And then other times I'm like with The Martian, I'm like, this is not fantasy. This is science fiction.
Yeah. I think as soon as you attach the like prefix hard to it. So if you say hard sci-fi, you're thinking like The Martian and something like that, or Interstellar.
Or like high
fantasy.
Like high fantasy, yeah.
Yeah. Like Lord of the Rings, no one's saying Lord of the Rings is never going to be science fiction. You know, it's always going to be high fantasy.
Yeah, why did we go with high fantasy and hard sci-fi and not, why isn't it like high sci-fi?
High fantasy and low sci-fi.
Yeah. I was like, high sci-fi somehow like is the rhyme there like doesn't work. Hard sci-fi I think does work better.
Yeah. High sci-fi.
More rigid genre lines. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that brings us to the final question, which as always is, Alex, if you were stranded on a desert island and could take a single book with you, which book would it be? Okay,
so when I saw this question, when you very kindly kind of send it ahead, wait, am I breaking the fourth wall here? Should I not have said that?
Shh, no one knows. It's a big secret.
Okay.
No, it's fine.
I was like, okay, take two. So
she didn't know. Yeah. She's making it up.
So I actually just recently rewatched the entire series Lost. Did you watch Lost back in the day?
I started watching Lost, but I never made it to the end, and everyone used to nag me about it. Well, and then I felt so vindicated when everyone hated the ending.
Yeah. It's not a good feeling when you're like, I knew my intuition was like, bail out now. It can only get worse from here.
Like I watched it when it was good and people liked it.
I will say, like, the first 3 episodes of Lost are such good, compelling storytelling to me. Like, I love going back and rewatching that pilot because it's like so well constructed and all the character work is so compelling. But having just rewatched Lost and now I'm watching Yellow Jackets, which is a different plane crash in the middle of the wilderness. Have you seen Yellow Jackets at all?
I've not. I see the billboards everywhere for it, but I've not watched it.
It's fantastic. And again, I'm not really a horror person. At least I didn't think I was, but it has like a slight element of horror fantasy-ish. It's really good. But so now I've watched these 2 survival shows, so immediately my brain goes to like, okay, the one thing, my main takeaway from Lost is how boring it would actually be most days to be trapped on a desert island. Yeah. So I would want a really long book. I would want a book that talked a little bit about hunting and trapping so I could potentially pick up some tips. And then I would also want a book that was long enough that I could, if it really came down to it, use a lot, like it would have a lot of pages so it would be good kindling. Like I could use it over multiple days. So I have settled on The Lord of the Rings. As long as it's like a special edition with an appendices on it, or appendix, it would just be the one, right?
Well, someone else some time ago picked Lord of the Rings and managed, and I made them prove it to me after the episode. They managed to find, there's a copy on Amazon you can buy, which is all 3 books like welded into one massive tome.
I think I had a bind up of all 3 books and even some of the appendices that were attached to it. And I was like, as I was thinking about this just now, I was like, well, yeah, I could like, especially if the appendices were there, or at least a section of like one of them. I think there are 6 different. Well, I was like, maybe I could teach myself Elvish to like pass the time. You know what I mean? Like really, like I guess I have a fear of being bored, but yeah.
Yeah, sounds like it.
I know. I was like, I wish I could have told you it was like some amazing book of my heart that I could reread 1,000 times over, but I am not someone who can just like continue to reread the same book. Yeah. And honestly, every single time I've tried to read The Lord of the Rings, I don't think I've ever fully made it through the first book because I always get stuck at when Tom Bombadil comes in.
Yeah, I knew it was going to be Tom Bombadil.
I was like,
it's all the songs and that.
Yeah,
oh my God.
I'm like, well, what am I doing here? Like, because at that point you've read so many pages about like describing the scenery and like and everything.
And then he sings another song.
And then he sings another song, and it's more. But like when you have all the time in the world while you're waiting to be rescued on a desert island. You're like,
yeah, you'd finally get past Tom.
Yeah, you'd finally get past Tom.
Of the book.
I think that's what I'm going to go with.
I mean, it's a classic. It's the grandfather of most fantasy. So
yeah, it's true. Every once in a while, I think about writing something, and if I'm like, oh, Lord of the Rings did something similar, if I can't improve on it, I'm not going to write it. Like or twist it in an interesting, compelling way.
Yes.
Yeah, I do love the world of the Lord of the Rings, but I don't know that now that I've said this, I don't know that I've ever fully finished the first book. I like jumped ahead to the second and third book. I was like, I don't need Tom Bombadil. I will get the like recap via film.
I'll figure
the
it
extended
out.
film editions, and then I will jump to books 2 and 3. I can't do Tom again. I can't meet him like this again.
Amazing. Well, it's a great choice. It's always going to be a classic. Thank you so much, Alex, for coming on the podcast and chatting with me. We've gone way over time.
Yeah,
and it's been absolutely
I'm so
fantastic. It was great. I didn't even notice. I was having so much fun. But thank you so much. It's been so great chatting with you and hearing about all of your experiences.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Such a pleasure. And for everyone listening, if you are wanting to keep up with what Alex is doing, you can follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Alex Bracken. You can also find her on Facebook, Pinterest, and Tumblr. The brand new book, Silver in the Bone, is out right now, so you can go and get it. And to make sure you don't miss an episode of this podcast, follow along on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. For more off-the-wall bookish discussion, check out my other podcast with YA authors Melissa Welliver and Naomi Gibson. That's The Chosen Ones and Other Tropes. Thanks again to Alexandra, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll catch you in the next episode.
Hello, Saver. Whether you're saving for that trip to the tropics or saving for an emergency, now is the time to take advantage of Wells Fargo's savings options. Wells Fargo offers savings accounts that can help you save towards your goals. So, what are you saving for? Visit a Wells Fargo branch or wellsfargo.com/save to open a savings account today.
Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.